Howdy boys and welcome to Mr. East Classroom. It's been a little while since we had a video, but I'm really happy to get back to it. In today's video we're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution, a document and a discussion I'm sure we've all been waiting for. I've been excited for it. It's real central to American history, and let's just dive right in. So where we left off in class, the new nation under the Articles of Confederation had reached a crisis point, or at least a crisis is what people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton would have been calling it at the time. There was a massive debt crisis, there was popular unrest like Shays' Rebellion, and generally speaking it looked like the new nation might collapse or might face sort of a disintegration amongst many states. So people like Hamilton, people like Madison, sent out a general call that there needed to be reform. What would eventually happen, or what did happen, was that the Confederation Congress passed a bill and sort of called a convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. So that convention that they called had delegates from most of the states. One or two states may have abstained, possibly Rhode Island. And all of those delegates were to come to the old State House in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, today known as Independence Hall. And it's the same building where they drafted and signed the Declaration of Independence. And they were supposed to come there to reform the Articles of Confederation to make them work better, to give the national government a little bit more power. Okay? Remember, the Articles had set up a very loose system of government, and the reason for that was that Americans were generally afraid of central government tyranny, something that they had at least perceived under the British regime. So the initial goal was loose government, but after a while under the Articles they were finding that their government was too loose and needed more power. When the delegates got there, what they quickly discovered within a day or so was that the old Articles were just not going to work, or at least no one there thought they were going to work. So what they immediately decided to do was throw all the Articles out and just write a new document, a new Constitution. And that is how the Constitutional Convention began. So just at the outset, to give you an idea for what this convention actually looked like, it was a total of 42 different delegates, all from different states, who all met in the State House from May to September of 1787. So it's a multi-month event. Now the guys assembled here, a lot of famous people. You have James Madison, you have Ben Franklin, you have George Washington, who will actually preside over the event. Alexander Hamilton's there. A lot of the big shots, a lot of the names you know, a lot of the key founding fathers are all here at the Constitutional Convention. Notable people who aren't here, people like Thomas Jefferson, and I don't believe that John Adams is present either, although some of John Adams' writings will be influential for it as well. The guys here are really thoughtful, really smart. You have a lot of lawyers. Generally, people there are fairly young, the average age being something like 40. A lot of lawyers. You have some inventors like Ben Franklin. You have some merchants and some plantation owners, even a couple of doctors. But these are all people who have pretty strong ideas about how government should work, and they're all people who have led through events during the Revolution. One thing we want to emphasize and that you need to pay attention to is that the Constitution, while generally trying to empower the federal government to do more things, is essentially a document of compromise. Remember, we have perspectives coming from 13 different states, okay? And not all of those states had the same vision of what the nation should look like. In fact, they had very strong competing visions. And so the Constitution should not read like coming from the mind of one man or any one set of people, but is a compromise basically to make the Union work, okay? And sometimes you'll hear a compromise called something where no one gets what they want, and that's partly true. But as we'll see, one guy got most of what he wanted. So if there's one founding father out of like the Big Five or Big Six that you haven't heard of, it's probably James Madison. This is a shame. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, and that's because he played probably the largest role in actually writing the thing. Now, James Madison has two really strong things going for him when he comes into the convention. He's coming out of Virginia. He was one of the key people in Congress who was calling for a revision of the Articles. And something that he's going to come in, that no one else is going to come in with, is a written plan for what the document should look like. And because he comes in with a plan, which we'll look at in a bit, he's going to get to set a lot of the tone for the day's events. Okay, and he'll basically be the starting point for the conversation about the structure of the national government. Second, and a clever thing, okay, if you're ever in an important place or you ever become a very important, powerful person, it'll behoove you to write down some notes of events. James Madison kept his own record of the Constitutional Convention, and actually he's going to be the only person with a full set of notes of the thing. So most of what we actually know about the daily details of what went on come to us from Madison's notes from the convention, and that's going to help paint him, of course, in a favorable light. And will just affect how we view the whole event. So that's why he's the father of the Constitution. As I said, it's a document of compromise. You had a lot of different perspectives coming into the convention. We want to focus in on a couple of key questions, a couple of different competing visions that had to be dealt with. The first one, which we'll see right off the bat, is the contest between the big states and the small states. I mean big in terms of population, but also in terms of geography. So the big states, especially when it comes to representation, are going to have different interests expressed, and the small ones are going to want to preserve their own sort of state sovereignty. They don't want to get swept up in the decisions of bigger states and bossed around. And making a document that's going to work for both of those two parties is going to be difficult. Additionally, a difference of vision that will come about is a difference between North and South, okay? And that will largely be over the institution of slavery. It doesn't explode in the Constitution the way obviously it will later on in the 1860s or 50s, but it is a big point of compromise as well. And secondly, the question of, what kind of government are we? Are we a republic or a democracy? And no one at the convention is going to be a radical Democrat. No one wants everyone to vote. But many people will think that, all this language of popular sovereignty, we need to be a very representative popular government. Other people will be very much afraid of the population, of the popular masses, or the mob as they might call it. And so how you form a government that emphasizes the liberty of a Republican government or sort of the equality of a Democratic government is going to be a difficult thing to work out. So how the actual convention went, as I said, had a lot to do with a plan Madison came in with, and that plan is known as the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan is basically going to depart radically from what the Confederation, or the Articles of Confederation, had set up. So, Madison's going to propose 3 branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, much like we have today, at least formally. And he's going to propose a bicameral Congress, a Congress with 2 houses, okay? Like the one we have now, but remember that the Articles only had a unicameral Congress, a Congress with 1 house. He's going to recommend, and this is the key part, representation based on population. That means that the members in Congress you have are based on how many people you have in your state. So bigger states will have more representatives, and smaller states will have fewer. Okay? Madison is from Virginia. Population-wise, Virginia is the largest state at this time. Hard to imagine now, but that's how it was then. And actually, it's this issue of representation that is going to be the first big dramatic problem. The 3-branch structure, no one really questions that off the bat. That most people will sign on that there needs to be an executive to actually command and order the government, like a president. And most people will sign on to a judiciary, although what those look like don't really get worked out until later on. Everyone's attention is going to be on the legislature, because that's what they're most used to working with under the Articles. And representation is going to be the key sticking point. So the big states are down with Madison's plan. Okay, they think that population-based representation is a great thing. New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, we're going to get a lot of say in what happens. Little states like New Jersey, like Rhode Island, okay, like a lot of the smaller New England states are really going to oppose this because they're going to think that they'll get swept up in this new national government. None of their say will be respected, and they'll get bossed around by the larger states. So they're going to come together and counter-propose the New Jersey Plan. So the New Jersey Plan basically kept the 3-branch structure of Madison's plan. Remember, he set the tone, and when you set the tone, you kind of get to dictate what people argue about. They keep the 3 branches, but they basically propose that the legislature is just like the Confederation Congress. Equal representation, 1 house, and every state gets 1 vote. So this would really be more of a reform of the Articles than an outright cancellation. The bigger states, a lot of people just aren't going to go for this, however, because that's going to lead to a congressional sort of lockstep, or not a lockstep, a kind of paralysis of Congress, and that you have all these states with one vote, and they all have to agree on something, so nothing gets done. And the bigger states also think it's ridiculous that a state as large as Virginia is held on equal footing as Rhode Island, which is very small, and that seems undemocratic to them, or unpopular, and so there'll be a lot of pushback. What will happen is basically a man from Connecticut, and I'm sure people help and contribute with him, but a man named Roger Sherman, a representative from Connecticut, comes up with what's called the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, but you can call it the Connecticut Plan too. And that will basically be Madison's plan combined with the New Jersey plan, and it's going to be the same three branches, except the legislature is bicameral, but the lower house is the House of Representatives, which we have today, which will be based on population, and the upper house, the Senate, will be based on equal representation. So every state gets the same amount of representatives. In this way, he splits the difference. He gives some popular control, a lot of popular influence in government. For instance, the House is the only house that can raise revenue bills, which is a tax bill. And the Senate has equal representation, and its members are chosen by the legislatures of each state. So not a democratic institution at all, but based on sort of a Republican representative, skeptical of popular government kind of position. So with this, they're going to be able to form a basic structure of government that most people can agree on. So another key issue of contention, and one that was big at the time and that is obviously big now with everything that's going on, was slavery, and the question of what do you do with slavery. So a lot of people, they read the Declaration, they heard the things being said during the American Revolution, and they kind of saw a big moral problem and a moral contradiction with slavery in a country that's claiming to sort of represent universal manhood rights, not necessarily women's rights. And many states, especially in the North at this time, will actually begin to outlaw slavery. So this is the beginning of a sectional divide with slave states and free states. Additionally, the Northwest Territory, we looked at it under the Articles, will prohibit slavery as well. But even Southerners who think slavery is bad, Thomas Jefferson famously thinks slavery is bad, most of them, however, can't imagine ending slavery. Honestly, many of them can't imagine a world where they think it's dangerous to basically have free black people, free African Americans running around. And they also don't think that you can send them back to Africa, so they believe that the best thing you can do is to keep them enslaved. Obviously, that would be a very controversial view today, but that's kind of how they thought about the question. But additionally, many Southerners, especially those in the Deep South, like in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina, for them slavery is immensely profitable. In Virginia, they'd already begun to exhaust the land, so profitability was less of a key question. But in the Deep South states, slavery is the name of the game, and to get rid of slavery, many thought would destroy their economy. So for pretty much all of the delegates coming out of the Deep South, if the Union prohibits slavery, you're not going to have a Union. One of the leading figures in that side is Charles Pinckney, from South Carolina. There's another Charles Cotesworth Pinckney from South Carolina you may hear about at some point. He's actually a different guy. But they are going to make their participation in the government, in the new nation, totally dependent on whether or not slavery is okay. And they're going to try and safeguard that. But many northern states will resent this slave-owning influence and think it's immoral. And so a big compromise they're going to have to work out is how do we have a country together? And that's key to understand that at this time, slavery is not the top of everyone's agenda. What's at the top of everyone's agenda is preserving the Union and making sure it works together, and that it's basically the promise of the Revolution, at least in independence and having an independent country, if not human equality, is preserved. One problem with that, okay, and a note you should make is that the word slavery never appears in the Constitution. Because they were kind of ashamed of it, they basically just use euphemisms or just avoid it altogether. They'd say unfree persons or something like that. One of the key issues that comes up is, again, representation. So instead of big states, small states, we have an issue where the question is, okay, to apportion House representation, should you count the population of slaves in a state? In a state like South Carolina, about half the population is enslaved. So whether or not you count slaves for representation matters a lot in a case like that. Obviously, Southerners are going to want it to where you count them for representation purposes, but Northerners will, and people in free states will generally say that you shouldn't do that. That's going to give you a disproportionate representation in Congress, especially because slaves can't vote. So what they'll come up with is a famous, or I should say infamous, compromise known as the 3/5 Compromise, which will basically say that people who are unfree in a state, remember they're not going to say slaves, people who are unfree in a state will count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. That's often made a lot of today, and for good reason, but you should recognize that the reason it exists is because it was an effort to limit the influence of slavery in government, as opposed to giving them sort of full representation. Another issue that they have to agree on is a lot of Northerners, or even some Virginians, wanted to ban the slave trade right out. But Southerners, deep Southerners, are utterly against this, and so they'll basically just punt on the issue. They'll say that you can't ban the slave trade for 20 years. Again, they won't say slave, they'll kind of use a euphemism. But and once that 20 years expires, it's actually interesting they do prohibit the international slave trade in 1808. But so the goal is basically going to be to do nothing about slavery and minimize its appearance in sort of the national language, and sort of punt it for a later time rather than risk disunion. All right. But what about the actual structure of the Constitution? This is something you're probably vaguely aware of, but we're going to run through what the basic layout of it all was and what the animating spirit was. So as we remember from a reading I had you do about Montesquieu and early state constitutions, there was this idea of the separation of powers, and that what you wanted to do in government, and this was a recent Enlightenment idea, but what you wanted to do to prevent tyranny was to spread out power and to create checks and balances. Another catchphrase you've probably heard a lot. And so what they wanted to do, what Madison laid out that they should do, based on state constitution examples, was to have 3 branches of government, and each one of those branches is laid out in a separate article of the Constitution. So if you ever hear about Article 1 or Article 2 powers, that's what they're referring to. So the first branch is actually the legislature, Congress. That's what they were most concerned about then, even though now most of the attention is paid to the executive branch. And the second branch was the executive, and third was the judicial. So in a big way, they actually envisioned the legislature as having the most power, because they thought that that was the branch most connected to the people and the most difficult one to corrupt, because so many people would be in it and so many different interests would be represented. The legislature, as hopefully we know today, is split between 2 houses. The House of Representatives, and representation in the House is based on population. Today it's capped at I think 436 members in the House, and that's split by population. At the time they were just adding as they went, and so obviously a state like Virginia gets the most representatives, whereas a small state like, say, New Hampshire got relatively few. In the Senate, the upper chamber, every state will receive equal representation, and they will get 2 representatives. Interestingly enough, the one provision in the Constitution that is stated that you cannot alter is equal representation in the Senate. So every state gets the same amount of representatives. The number that it's always been for us has been 2, and they all serve 6-year terms. The terms in the Senate, right, are staggered. So every 2 years, a third of the Senate is elected, whereas the House members are elected every 2 years. Important to note that at the time, senators were not elected popularly, and in fact that won't change until, I believe, 1913, with the, I want to say the, put me on the spot, I think the 16th Amendment. It's either the 16th or the 17th. It's that or the income tax. But anyhow, they'll have equal representation, and that will basically give the small states a feeling of equality, of parity with the larger states. The president, the executive branch. So you know a lot of the president's powers, but in general what he was supposed to do was to sign on legislation and sort of execute the actual laws, to uphold the laws. And so he has both a veto power, which he can either sign on or reject legislation from Congress. He's sort of the final signature on it. He's also the commander-in-chief, so he technically controls the military, and will perform all of sort of the executive functions of government. So everything from running the post office to performing diplomacy. Okay, he's the operational head of the government. But his powers were laid out very vaguely in the Constitution, and it's only with time that you actually fill out what the president is supposed to be. So in addition to having all the written rules of the Constitution, we have all of these unwritten, sort of understood rules that pop up over time. Lastly, we have the Supreme Court. They set up the idea of a Supreme Court. Article 3 is very loose, however, and the exact powers that the court has were kind of vague. And again, those are going to get filled out over time. But the one thing they did set up is that that court will have the power to set up other smaller courts, federal courts, and that it will have a chief justice, not chief executive. I have a typo here. And here we have the signing of the Constitution. Of course, Washington himself presided over the convention. That didn't mean he was there every single day. It was sort of an honorific role. And really, he didn't say a whole lot or publish a whole lot of his thoughts at the convention, nor did Ben Franklin. And something interesting is that they didn't want to say too much because they knew people, if they heard about it, would really respect their opinion. And they were worried that by giving their thoughts, they'd kind of dictate where the nation went. And they wanted to be hands-off. But Washington, of course, is going to be our first president, which we'll look at later. And it's kind of symbolically important that he presided over the writing of the Constitution. So finally, they finished everything up with this basic structure. And on September 17th, 1787, the delegates signed it. 3 refused to sign and went home, but the rest signed it. And, well, that's where we'll leave that story and talk about some of the unfinished business that they had. So now that they had written the document and had it all polished up toward the fall of 1787, there's a lot of big questions, okay? So who gave them the authority to write this document? No one. They claimed it for themselves. They were sent there to reform the Articles, but what they did was write a whole new Constitution, and they were aware of this fact. So they wondered, 1, how do we enact it, and 2, how do we grant it legitimacy? What they're ultimately going to decide is that all the states, in a kind of popular way, are going to have to ratify the document, which we'll look at later. And when we see that fight, well, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights. But you're probably wondering, after we mentioned all this, well, where's the Bill of Rights, right? Those 10 big, important amendments that lay out so many freedoms that today we hold dear. Well, that's not actually in the original Constitution, and it won't actually come around for a couple of years more. And we'll see how that happens in class. But just to remember that the original Constitution does not include a Bill of Rights. They're amendments, literally changes to the Constitution or additions. And the original Constitution was much more about giving power to the government. Sort of checks on that power will then come later. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the ratification debates. But for now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you all in class.